Hajime!
Greetings and salutations, honored legionaries. Today I have a special treat for you. Here in the war room, we're in the jungle rainforests of undisclosed location of the Golden Triangle. We're here right now in the underground bunker, and I'm joined with us by the warrior philosopher, and he has tidings of radical aesthetics, Eros, and the will. But in all seriousness, though, legionaries, there's a great essay that Warrior just wrote talking about basically the metaphysics of being versus becoming, about the ideal which we hold, and to what ends do we become, and what does it mean to be, and what does it necessarily, as a corollary, mean to become, right? So a kind of causal relationship between the two. And I kind of wanted to deep dive into this because ultimately, as tangential and abstract as this may sound, you know, the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk by communist radicals has definitely woken up many Americans. But something that I think a lot of people take for granted is the idea that communists have this kind of ascendant power, but it's because of the conservative insistence on the sclerotic being of 1776 that defines them, but it's already a dead letter 12 years into having been written a long time ago. And so what does that mean for us, we patriots? If we want to become Americans, if we want to be Americans, we have to become it. And every generation is a constant living organic development towards an ideal that has yet to be revealed, that has to be constantly reinforced, exalted, and I guess represented in an aesthetic sense. But without further ado, welcome, Warrior. Thank you for coming on the transmission.
Thank you. And Lance, my friend, please call me Patrick. My name is Patrick Saltykov, the true Tsar of the new Russian Empire that I shall found once I have secret magi working in the court of Putin. The Duginists are actually secretly Saltykov loyalists. Dugin is actually secretly one of my agents, and he's purposely infiltrating the Russian system from the inside. So very soon I will send my order, and we will orchestrate a coup d'etat to install me back into my rightful place as emperor of the Neo-Russian Empire. But it's good to be here. Thank you, Lance. And is Sergeant Barnes having a good time?
He's out
in the command center.
He's out beyond the wire right now with the boys doing a counterinsurgency. So he'll be reporting back later. No, but yes, Dark Ocean Society. Yes. And also, you go to hell if you do not believe. No, in all seriousness, though, I wanted to ask you about your essay because it really struck me, and it's something that you and I have been developing for a long time and thinking about. And you really articulated in this short essay, which I will be adding into the notes below, Legionaries, if you want to give it a read yourself. Obviously, we're going to have a very topical discussion regarding it and the kind of, the concepts around the essay. But if you want to understand more deeply where we're coming from, just take a look at that. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, just as a question, because what is it that made you want to write about this and I guess proffer a different vision than I would even say, and this is what's so radical and interesting about it, what's so frankly morally courageous in a way, is that an embrace of a different vision, of a different way of even being, that is kind of shorn of these moral pretenses that we're used to in the last, let's say, 300 years or so, with liberalism and so on. I wanted to give you, I guess, just your preliminary thoughts as to why it is that you have this vision, what it is in specific, and then we'll just take it from there.
Well, it's a attack, of course, on the static conception of being, and recently with explorations into Heidegger's being contra, for example, the early Vedic being as Atman, as self, which was something that I've been learning about in a philosophy class in college right now. And you see for example, you have it with Heidegger, you have it with Buddhism as well, which asserts anatta, or no self. And all these things are essentially rejecting a static soul, a static being that is unchanged beyond the physical, which is what you get with Hinduism. It's what you get with Christianity and, of course, all the other Abrahamic religions. It's really what you get with most religion, even within paganism, which is a lot more life-affirming than the Abrahamic faiths. There still is this sense of the immortal soul, which goes down to hell in the Nordic tradition, or Valhalla, or the realm of Ran, the deep sea. There's also, of course, Elysium in Hellenic paganism, or for most people, the fields of Asphodel, or even Tartarus for the worst. But there's a sense of an immortal soul. And what I wanted to sort of attack in this essay was very much so the static being that comes with an immortal soul, that comes with being in such a way that is defined primordially, and thus is a sort of determinism. And through this essay, I'm really trying to affirm agency, affirm free will, and affirm the creative power of metaphysics, rather than metaphysics as a sort of transcendent element that is pre-existent. And a lot of fans of my work, of course, love Julius Evola. And one of the biggest problems with Evola, ultimately, is that his entire justification for his philosophical and worldview comes from believing the transcendent comes before us, and that the only way to achieve high spiritual qualities and to achieve higher culture in victory and the purpose of an imperium is by reverting to these past sacred principles that are pre-existent and transcendent. Whereas what I'm trying to do, especially with radical aesthetics, is very similar to, for example, the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle, sort of creating a value out of art. It's very similar to the Hegelian system. One of the worst things Lance ever said was that it wasn't worth reading Hegel, and I believed Lance. But I've been re-exploring it and realizing perhaps we were too quick to judge.
I think so too.
There's actually a lot of
I do apologize. I do apologize. I was incorrect. But if you don't mind me interrupting, Warrior,
course,
please
go ahead.
do not cut off my penis. Thank you very much. No, but in all seriousness, though, it's very interesting. And just to reiterate what Warrior is saying, I guess from a Western tradition, to make it, I guess, a little bit more parochial and more familiar to us, this is the distinction between Plato and Aristotle. Plato, the great ideal of forms, the metaphysical idea that there exists a realm of perfect forms, and that we have archetypes of being, right? Whereas in contradistinction, Aristotle believed that the world is as it is, as we are. Like, for instance, the world, there's no such thing as profane and the sacred. We are in the divine. Our experience of life is the divine. And the Buddhists would call this samsara, of course. But the interesting thing about Aristotle's I guess, life-affirming aspect, that there are no ideal forms. There is simply the ideal mean, the golden mean, the kind of constitution, an essential quality of a being that can be self-constituted, as opposed to being a replication, a shade, as Plato would say, in another world. I think this is an important distinction. And I think this is why, actually, the metaphysical concept of Evola, of Plato, and by default, because Christianity leveraged a lot of Plato, right, into Neoplatonism and so on, by way of Neoplatonism, this idea of the metaphysical being, the deism, that we are simply shades or aspects of a divine whole that's beyond this world, is that we start to understand that everything in this life matters, that there is a way of defining the environment around us as a divine existence. And so all the aesthetic representations of ourselves are themselves divine, and there's no such thing as profane. But here's where I'd like to, I guess, maybe play devil's advocate, Warrior, if you don't mind.
No, I do mind. You're going to get executed. No, I'm kidding. Of course. Go ahead.
No, there's a very common, I guess, parry to this argument that if there is no ideal, if there is no, let's say, archetype of the perfect, that there is no object of the perfect, and therefore it is impossible to make a meaningful distinction between good or bad, or rather good or evil, but like in our terms, right, because we're beyond these petty moral concepts of our present, but good and bad. And so, for instance, if we are infinite beings in a, like, obviously sacred world, and we can create according to our own will, according to our own aesthetic will, does it not follow that leftists have no intrinsic, let's say, not argument, but they're roughly just as correct as we are in affirming our forms and radical aesthetics and ideals into the world? There's no meaningful way of combating them.
Well, going back to Plato and Aristotle, the primary difference is this interconnectedness of noumena and physis, which is something you also see with Kant contra Hegel, which is interesting. So there's a similar sort of evolution. Of course, Aristotle still sort of believes in the virtue that exists within the ebbs and flows of nature, but of course, to him, there is more of an interplay, or let's say a dialogue with nature and understanding virtue through physis, right? That there is not necessarily this binary the same way that Plato asserts. And with Kant, you have a similar sort of evolution from Plato to Aristotle, with Kant to Hegel. And with Kant, he also sort of believes that noumena, the sensory world, is relatively, either difficult or impossible to reach. And Hegel rejects this as well. So in a lot of ways, from Plato to Aristotle, you have a similar thing going on from Kant to Hegel. And these all four of these people sort of believe in pre-existent virtues to some degree, but then it's more of a manner of how do you attain those virtues? How do you discover those virtues? And of course, this is where my thinking strays from them and is perhaps more in line with thinkers such as Nietzsche or even Heidegger, who's more skeptical as to what lies beyond, let's say. And I bring up Buddhism because Buddhism in its diagnostic of reality is very revolutionary for the time that it existed. Of course, in my essay, I open with the Upanishads, which is essentially what comes after the Vedas. So the Vedas are very much more religiously based texts. They tell you how to worship the gods. It does not talk too much about an ontology of being, whereas the Upanishads actually have the gods as subordinate to Brahman, the entirety of all existence. And of course, within my essay, I'm talking about the static self, which is an extension of Brahman, and that the purpose for the Hindu is to return to Brahman. And the Buddhists say, well, actually, we believe in the concept of no return. We believe in anatta, no self. And they take a very phenomenological approach to life, of course, with the five aggregates, consciousness, which you would largely equate to the soul in Hinduism or Christianity. Consciousness is a product of material functions leading up to consciousness. And their conception of reincarnation isn't the same as a reincarnation of a soul, but more so that our interplay of energy echoes into other beings after us, and that we don't really die. You don't really die. You really, you're the essence of what you are continues within the cosmos and continues on, very similar to Bataille's view of death as well. But of course, with nibbana and no return within Buddhism, it's actually the end of the samsara. It's the end of reincarnation, and it's complete peace and detachment from a life which is inherently suffering. And of course, this is where I would disagree, because it's a very life-denying religion. So their diagnostics are actually quite correct, but the results of those diagnostics that they come to are incorrect. And this is important because we're going to bring up Plato and Aristotle and Hegel or Kant, and there's a lot of value in their philosophy, because, for example, with Aristotle and Hegel, art begins to be this form of understanding the transcendent, which, of course, I disagree with, but there's some value here. They see art as a form which is actually molded by virtue and by like this sort of absolute ideal beyond the fray. And art is sort of this bridge between nature and the spiritual. And what I take from that is not that art is the bridge between a pre-existent spiritual, but in fact that, of course, we begin with nature, we begin with physis and the natural world, but art is more so an unveiling and assertion of a will and of resultant properties and of aesthetics entirely from us ourselves. It is not reaching back, but it is a reaching forward, and it is a touching into eternity which lies beyond us. So as to say that our being within my conception of all this is not something that pulls back from something behind it. My assertion of art and beauty do not come from a predetermined, predefined art and beauty. They're not even interpretations of something beyond or before me, the way that I would interpret both Aristotle and Hegel's sort of view of art, but something entirely new and entirely dynamic and entirely undetermined, right? Mm-hmm. And to reach that, of course, within my essay, it takes a lot of different factors which all revolve around strife and revolve around an appropriation of the forces that come out of chaos. Of course, Eros, the will to hatred, love, inspiration, these all come out of chaos initially, even within Hesiod's theogony. Chaos is the first existent thing, and out of that you get Gaia, the earth, and you get Tartarus, the underworld, and from there you get the Titans, and from there you get the gods. So even the gods are part of a process that begins with chaos, right? But they're not something predetermined or pre-existent. They come out of physis, even within this whole conception, which is quite interesting. And the whole point of what I'm trying to assert is that we have to let go of static being. We have to let go of a predetermined static self, and you could apply this to modern politics. People take the Constitution as this unassailable, perfect doctrine that without which we will fall into ruin. If we stray further from the Constitution, we'll fall into ruin. This is funny because I asked Charlie Kirk a question once, and he said those exact things, that the Constitution ought to be a northern star. And this is precisely why conservatives lose, is because whenever you try to preserve, you intentionally lose. You can see this in the Iliad. Hector, by all utilitarian modern morality, is the good guy of the Iliad. He is the good guy. Right. He is defending his family. He's not arrogantly or ambitiously expanding. He's only protecting what he has. So what happens? He loses. His wife is probably raped and killed. Of course, there's different accounts, right? His child is probably thrown off the walls of Troy. His entire homeland is raped and killed. Minus Aeneas.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just like Patton would say, no one ever defended anything successfully. There's only the attack. And this is true spiritually, right? This is true aesthetically. This is true culturally. And if I might interject, because I'm a simple soldier warrior, if you don't mind explaining it Barney style for me. So you're saying that we can maintain an essential nature without preserving the perfect form of previous forms, right? Is that what you're kind of saying to me? Because that's what I kind of understand, is that we can still be essentially Americans without having to be, let's say, slaves to very specific crystallizations born from the past. Is that correct?
Well, also to see it as something evolving, right? The form, for example, if you take will to power or Eros or even beauty does have certain objective qualities. Nobody believes a fat woman is beautiful. But for example, some of our friends might dally with Asian women, right? They might like that look. They might like European women. They might like Latin women. We have many of our conquistador bros, doing miscegenation on a large scale in Latin America. But ultimately there still is a form of beauty. Nobody finds a fat woman beautiful, because within nature there is a certain determination of certain qualities emulated, which refer to life affirmation and life denial, going back to it. But so that's the general form of beauty is a wide umbrella, and within that wide umbrella are a lot of different forms and a lot of subjectivity, but there's still ultimately a determining factor, right? And applied to America and excellence and power and regality, trying to be a world hegemon, there are certain forms which persist and that we ought to retain. But within those wider forms, there are also smaller forms like the Constitution, specific tools or instruments that contextually at the time of its inception were proper and worked. And I think that's how we should view tradition. That's how we should view aesthetics. That's how we should view all these things as things that contextually and within the consequences of their value at the time, right? They had a specific purpose. Even Evolan, the aesthetics of Evolan philosophy are quite beautiful. He talks about the Roman rituals. He talks about things like defotio, the sacrifice the Roman would make for his republic early on, and of course the empire later. These are all sort of timeless things, but the way that they manifest are different. And the way that they manifest are through evolution, not through a return or calling back to, for example, a god that said so a long time ago, or a book that said so a long time ago, hermetic or esoteric texts. Everything is about constant evolution, constant expansion. That's the most important thing, expansion. You cannot retain molar structures. This is the things that a lot of post-Marxists and post-structuralists get right. Of course, they're deconstructivists, so they're also not asserting anything. They're only trying to tear down tradition. But what they say that is correct is, of course, that tradition itself lacks a transcendent element. Now, what they fail to do is to recognize that even if it lacks a transcendent element, that does not mean that it lacks an element to apply to the future. And this is where people like Jason Drujani and novel folklore come in. This is where Nietzsche critiques positivism, reductionism, and modern liberalism, and utilitarianism, really, is that without a mythos to inspire action towards the sublime in the future, action towards that which does not have a material purpose necessarily. If you take evolution, why did we evolve past a cockroach? Cockroaches are the most successful at adapting to survive in a variety of different environments. Humans can't. We are not very adaptable. It is our techniques and our ability to create that actually makes us more adaptable. But in terms of survivability, we're actually quite fragile. Right. And there's a lot of things that could go wrong with us. We don't reproduce that fast. Right, we have a lot of different things that actually stop us from surviving.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
And this ties back to Bataille and Bataille's critique of utilitarianism, which I've been exploring recently, and his whole desire of excess energy and the appropriation of excess energy towards these things that don't have a utilitarian purpose, towards things that we find beautiful, the molding of the erotic and the sacred and the profane. All these things matter because in the modern age, especially in the modern capitalist age, and Marxism does this too in a different way, everything's been utilitized, structured to work in a certain way that is most beneficial for the most amount of people. But time and time again, we find what people want is not comfort. What people want is not to have their resources perfectly aligned. I mean, most people in America today live in relative comfort, but they have this neurosis in their souls. Of course, we don't believe in the soul as such, but the soul as this dynamic and evolving consciousness, they're not satisfied by utility. What they want is the sacred mixed with the profane. What they want is excess. What they want is the sublime. And that only comes through seeing life as in flux, seeing being in flux, seeing reality in flux, seeing it as malleable and changeable, and that there are no perfect answers to anything. This is the problem with reductionism, scientific positivism, is that science doesn't have all the answers today. We talked about this in our video on Heidegger. Science doesn't have all the answers. And once you try to create an answer for everything, that's when everything devolves, because now you're trying to preserve. You're trying to preserve a perfect structure, when in reality, there are certain wider forms that you appropriate and you adopt for the future, but you don't preserve them. You allow them to expand and flourish, and sometimes they burn out, right? They burn out too quickly, and that's it's a sad thing, but it's necessary. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I don't want to forget this thought. It's basically this good critique about monotheistic religions and the reason why they have less social currency. For as much as there is truly a resurgence of religions in general, whether it's Islam, Christianity, whatever, I feel like it's much more affected. It's not necessarily that people are truly believe in the way that medieval people used to actually believe in it. And I think that the difference is that what these religions, especially Platonic religions, which Islam is also one of these religions, what they do is they promise too much. They promise to be the truth with a capital T, and obviously that is that is making too many promises. It's just so far. It's such a far-ranging claim that it's impossible to actually hold that conviction through lived experience. And in the scheme of humanity as such, the religion that came from the Abrahamic religions of the post, let's say, Christian era, right, or the Christian era, has been a very short-lived religion. I mean, as much as it may be far-reaching in its effects and its consequences, it is true that it's also died out very quick. And I'm not here to critique it one way or another, but it's just to illuminate the greater idea that when you promise too much in this way, the world has a way of reclaiming it. And it's interesting to me because a lot of people, I guess, just to kind of go back to my original question, Warrior, about competing visions of the sublime, because it's clear to you and I that there are many different visions of what the sublime is. I mean, we're living through it now, and there's people killing each other over it. I mean, literally, Charlie Kirk was literally assassinated based on certain people not liking his vision of what is the sublime to him. And the interesting thing to me is that the truth is, in the capital T sense, that the ideals of people and nations are multitudinous and multifarious, and that they don't necessarily exist within one entity. They can also be self-sufficient or isolated, right? They're born not out of juxtaposition from another thing, right? Not a metaphysical being, but ex nihilo, which is the concept of chaos, right? Chaos is literally the deistic embodiment of ex nihilo, right? Nihilo. And if you don't mind me reading from Kostin Alamaru's book, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, I know we haven't gotten into it yet, but I think it's definitely worth reading, Warrior. I don't know if you've read it. Have you read it?
Yeah, I've read most. Well, I could say most of it. It's a very long book. I read most of the beginning part of it.
All right, perfect. Then you'll be right into it. Well, basically, and not to be confused with BAP. Apparently, they're mortal enemies. I didn't know this, but yeah. So don't.
Yeah, BAP is anti-Semitic, and we love Israel. Give them more money.
Yeah,
no, I'm just kidding.
They need more money for for missiles. More missiles. It says in the Bible, "Thou shalt give more missiles." No, we're going to go back here. And anyway, Kostin is talking about Western civilization, about Greek civilization, and he views them as distinct, right? Obviously, they're very distinct beings. There's a continuity, at least in elements, of Western and Hellenic civilization. However, they are separate, essential beings, right? And basically, he talks about the idea that a nation is the aesthetic representation or fleshing out of an ideal, right? And the nomos, right? The nomos is effectively what a nation considers to be culture, to be norms, to be mores, and all of those three different elements are kind of the logistical, let's say, structures which create an ideal or buttress an ideal through time, right? A nation is an ideal form through time that is manifested organically through an erotic vision, right? And erotic, by the way, legionaries, I don't mean like sex in the base sense. I mean, spiritually speaking, that which you have love for, right? That which you're motivated by. And visuals and aesthetics of those things. And aesthetics is not simply like seeing something beautiful, it's also the feeling one gets from living in such a way that is in line with what you deem to be the sublime. And so I'm reading here, and he gives a good argument as far as what it is that distinguishes nations, right? And this comes from Friedrich Nietzsche's the idea of every nation has above itself one goal, a goal that it's constantly trying to evolve into, that it's trying to not acquiesce, but acquire, right? And so I'm reading here from Dr. Alamario. Friedrich Nietzsche, speaking of the different goals of different peoples, states of the Greeks, "You shall always be the first and excel all others. Your jealous soul shall love no one unless it be a friend." That made the soul of the Greek quiver. Thus he walked the path of his greatness. The pursuit of excellence, the desire to be proven the best compared to all other men, is the foundation of all Greek culture. Victory, the contest, or agon, is taken to be the demonstration of such excellence and superiority. The clearest and most manifest exhibition of the superiority was in physical contest, in victory in physical contest, and in the exhibition of bodily beauty. The aim was now to develop the body to the highest perfection of beauty, a purpose for which each individual had to submit to a methodical discipline just as severe as training in the arts, denying himself any personal manifestations of genius. And genius, by the way, is the idea of like your unique self-understanding, so free radical understanding that is divergent from the shared ideal of a nation, right? That's what genius means in this context. And so, last paragraph here. The central institution of the polis was the gymnasium. The gymnasium was the center of Greek social life in the cities. The original meaning of virtue, or arete, is precisely the type of excellence in which superiority over others is manifested in various struggles, whether athletic or intellectual, but both have their origins in military training of the citizen. Now, the last part is not necessarily relevant in what we're talking about per se, but it should call to mind specifically the the individual nature, unique nature of each nation. As Almario expounded here in the quality of the Greeks, he discussed the central institution that made up the essential character of Greeks, right? So they had a goal, right? To excel all others, to love none except for one's friend. That is what erotically motivated the spirit of a Hellene. And that manifested in a physical form in their way of association. So, in this case, for the Greek polis, that meant, the gymnasium, or in, the Platonic times, which is during the Peloponnesian War, the sophistic argumentation in the academies. Now, this is significant because if you extrapolate this out, what Almario is saying, and obviously in consequence Nietzsche is saying, and of course what we're talking about, is that every person is every great man is the progenitor of a nation, a goal, right? Which is an organic vision of the future, one of breeding, which is the concept of his thesis. But each goal is unique, and therefore the multifarious quality of different nations is manifest differently. So what does that mean? That means the American essential quality is very distinct from, let's say, the Hellene, or the Britannic, or the French, and so on. And they're manifested in the specific day-to-day, day-to-day living being activities, which is what Heidegger talks about Dasein, and how we derive the essential quality of our character from the everyday activities which we engage in. Because if we're going to be honest with ourselves, there's nothing stopping us from doing anything per se. But the reason why we fall into a groove, especially those of us who have the agency to fall into any other kind of groove or mold, is that we find a specific type of life to be the most meritorious, to be the most excellent, to be the best. And obviously, if you've followed me for a long time at Lance's Legion, I love military life in all its facets, and obviously this might diverge a little bit from Warrior Philosopher a little bit, but it definitely diverged vastly from, let's say, someone who believes in absolute equality and the basically turning of humanity into the amorphous cockroach. Okay, so ultimately, this is why Being and Becoming by Saltykov, by Pat, right here, is so important, because without the understanding that we as Americans have an essential nature, we are not able to adapt to the future, and the present obviously, but to the future, with basically being dragged down by forms which have long since been let's say, eviscerated in relevance. I think that the Constitution itself, and Alemario talks about this, that laws themselves are crystallizations, rather after effects, of custom. Custom is the essential nation of a culture, right? And so the Constitution itself is just a crystallization. It's a falsehood. It's a thing that has long lost its relevance, and it doesn't define the American nation. The American nation has nothing to do with the Constitution. The Constitution is a product of the American nation. These are not the same thing. But don't be alarmed. Do not feel lost if we don't have the Constitution, because tomorrow, let's say, the American Constitution, if we just completely forgot what it was and it was burned and no one had a relevance for what it was, we would still be essentially Americans because of our shared customs and beliefs and ideals. Now, it has yet to be expounded as far as what the American ideal necessarily is, and there have been a lot of forays into this, but I think we're too young of a nation, still fledgling nation, to be able to articulate what it is that we find the most beautiful. And I think this is where you and I, Legionaries, me and Pat ourselves, have been trying to show people what our future is. And basically what is the most evocative ideal that actually cuts through to the essential nature of being an American. At least that's how I see myself and how I see our American nation, is that we're not the Constitution, we're something that is becoming. We're becoming towards maybe the best way I've heard America defined as is a Faustian nation, archetypically Faustian. And for those of you who don't know Faust by Goethe, it's this idea of this guy who knows everything and who makes a pact with the devil, I believe, in which the idea is that he is endowed with the ability to learn everything, and all the secrets of the universe will be laid bare before him, and that the moment that he becomes bored, all right, with the searching and prevailing and conquest of knowledge, that the devil will claim his soul. So what does this mean? Is basically when he becomes bored of basically finding all the secrets of the universe, he'll go to hell, but he never becomes bored, really. I mean, that's the ultimate crux of the story, and that the lack of boredom is the cause of his greatness, to overcome all obstacles and to find the truth in all things. Now, I don't know if this necessarily appeals to my personal archetypical like personality, I'd say, but I would definitely think that's probably the closest ideal to what an American truly is. It has nothing to do with Walmart. It's not Gordon Gekko. It's definitely not MLK. It's something far different than that and a far more evocative. But Warrior, I wanted your, I guess, exposition as to what Eros is, because I think that's probably the essential question of our time, is what is it that motivates man as himself, as a nation, and what does this have to do with aesthetics?
Well, of course, out of chaos, you have emergent properties, which some people might even say are accidental, or at least are not intentional. And of course, that's the difference between viewing the universe as omnipresent, of course, existent in all things, logos, versus omnipotent, which would be the case with, for example, the Abrahamic God having created everything, and thus having created a will with a more or less predetermined character and a specific destination that will ought direct itself towards, and even the opposite, right? The absence of that good is also a will of its own, but of course inherently is pushed into existence. It is caused by God. And Eros, in my conception, is not something that was determined via a god or an omnipotent entity. It came as a result of randomness and disorder, which I guess you could almost equate to the same thing, entropy, so to speak. So naturally, you get certain things that come about from nature, such as animal evolution, and of course with that evolution, they are instinctually and biologically determined to be a certain way. Of course, the spider does not think about this web that it's going to cast, sometimes very intricately, quite beautifully, it does not think to create that. That's not even instinct. That's really just biological. It's born with that ability. It's not even like a slightly higher being, like a squirrel, for instance, which has pattern recognition, and all of the actions throughout its life will be as a result of the things that it encounters as a squirrel, and determines for itself certain actions in the context of its specific time, good and bad, etc. The Eros, of course, exist, I would say, on a spectrum, but so far as the human Eros and the human will, we've reached the point of cognitive abilities that we can now act both outside of instinct and also outside of utility. And this is where Bataille, again, becomes incredibly important with this, and it goes into art as well. We have the ability to attain abundance. This is something that just is not present in any other being for the most part. And as humans, and of course this is where Heidegger comes into importance, are thrownness into a world which already exists, and us as temporal beings within the world, aware that we will one day die, and aware of our own being, are also thrust to act in such a way. There's no just instinctual way that we're going to act. We have to think, and we have to think about our actions. And again, there's a spectrum to it. Some people are hardly sentient, and they're hardly acting. They're almost reduced to inputs and outputs.
Yeah.
But we have the capability, and I would say the will towards non-utilitarian action, which is precisely why ideologies such as liberalism and Marxism are insufficient, in such that they're only attempting to reach a utilitarian ends, which is why I always say they're essentially the same thing. And this is something Evola talks about as well in regards to capitalism and Marxism. And of course, Evola is trying to seek the non-utility in tradition and into pre-existent transcendent beings. And of course, that's where we differ. But there's this element of utility being insufficient, because once we have excess, once we have abundance, we start to reach a point where we're just dissatisfied. Well, we want more. And you talked about the Faustian nature of America. I think this is present perhaps in most cultures, again, on a spectrum, some greater than others. But the whole Faustian thing is, if you don't continue expanding and you have nowhere else to expand, you're going to start to eat yourself. Of course, Nietzsche says, in times of peace, the warlike man essentially destroys himself. I'm paraphrasing here.
No, that's exact. That's the exact
perfect.
Quote. Yeah, that's exact.
Perfect.
Quote.
And what this is illustrating is again, it all comes back to contra utility, contra this idea that we can materially satisfy our urges and our needs. Eros is precisely that beyond utility. It's this feeling that we have which drives us towards actions like will to power, so on and so forth. I mean, we don't just want to be satisfied, because we've seen this time and time again. Nobody's happy once they reach satisfaction. It's always in the journey towards satisfaction that we're happy. And once we reach abundance, which is unnatural, which is not determined by nature, because nature has no room for abundance. The only thing that's abundant is the sun, and it's nearly infinite energy that comes down upon us. Besides that, there's nothing abundant. Everything is competing for resources. And there's another thing. The sun only sends down a certain amount of energy. There's still limitations even within the things that are seemingly unlimited. Even within something unlimited like the sun, the earth is limited. Resources and space on the earth is limited. It's something Bataille talks about. And for example, you take I believe the first life, of course, started aquatically. And out of that, once you have the space taken up in the water, now you begin to have a search for more space onto land and more space onto the air. But essentially, there's this overcrowding of different wills and different beings in contention with one another, and a limited amount of resources. And humans have the ability to surpass that. Of course, we still live in such a way where our resources are not equally distributed. But take the Western world, for instance. There's largely not necessarily parity, because there's some people who are incredibly wealthy, but there is this baseline of comfort that most people can attain in the developed world. And out of that, we see that having those basic survival necessities met is insufficient in dealing with this existential angst that humans face. People are not satisfied. We live in one of the most, let's say, prosperous ages, the most prosperous age in human history. And yet the most prosperous countries a lot of times have the highest levels of mental illness. And this is not just because with better medical care you have more diagnosis. It's also because people are just, they lack purpose. And you say, well, what is that purpose? And this is where Bataille's excess comes into play, that, unless we recognize that our excess energy, our abundance, must be redistributed and dispensed towards non-utilitarian actions such as art, such as these great projects such as the moon landings, which is something I talk about in my essay as well. Unless we redirect this excess energy towards those things, then we're just going to be depressed, because it all comes back to this existential assertion of the will.
Yes.
Right? Even religious people are existentialists on some degree. They're just committing social suicide, that Camus points out. Ebola, Christians, Hindus, they're all dealing with the existential problem of what do we do when we have time to think? That's what it is. What do we do when we have time to ponder reality? If you don't have time, you don't have to worry about it. If you're being chased by that lion, 12 hours a day and you're sleeping the other 12 hours a day, you don't really have any time to think about these problems. Maybe that's a sort of ignorance is bliss situation, but once you do have that time to sit with your thoughts and think about reality, now you're faced with existential questions. And existential questions for humans require existential answers. The problem is that certain answers are life-denying because they restrict our ability to interact with the world around us, and some of them are life-affirming and expand our ability to interact with the world around us. This is the whole point of what I'm getting at, and what I'm trying to do is conduct or cultivate an ethic which will very much expand our ability to interact in the world, which also means being what's the word I'm looking for? Being cognizant of the importance of power. You can't just be the artist; you must also be the warrior. This is what something I talk about all the time. War. The martial virtue. Military states often create the best arts because you need first the military to attain the peace so that the artist can work in peace, quote unquote. Of course, I would like a synthesis of the two.
And this is not to conflate with utilitarianism. Warriors saying basically we're mastering utility not for its own sake, which is what our modern society is doing. We're doing it for something higher, more sublime. And if I might just say so, it's interesting that you talked about basically how this plenitude of resources. I mean, for instance, just to add a little factoid here to what you talked about in the prosperous quality of specifically Western nations, there hasn't been an American who's starved to death since 1978. Literally, that was the last recorded instance of starvation to death. Back in ancient times, that was a very common thing, especially for street urchins and so on. Therefore, going forward, what this means to us is with this time and this plenitude of resources, which is really unparalleled in all of human history, unless if you believe in Agartha and Atlantis, and you should, Legionary, by the way. They existed. You go to hell if you don't. But either way, what I'm trying to say is we have to answer to ourselves the thoughts of purpose and meaning that come to us in the dead of night when we're in repose and alone with our thoughts and alone with our friends, right? And so I think what's the most interesting thing Warrior has to say, and what he and I have been trying to argue, is that the post-structuralists are correct, right? That basically meaning doesn't have intrinsic meaning necessarily. It's one that one has posited, right? Now, you can say nothing means anything, world is a fuck, let's just, cut off our phalluses and pretend to be women. Or you can affirm in the realm of chaos, which is meaninglessness, affirm a reason, right? An active ideal, act on it, and basically choose a heroic life, a heroic spirit. And this is where he talks about in the last paragraph here of Radical Aesthetics, an essay by warrior philosopher Pat great thing. And if you don't mind me reading, Pat, I'd like to read this in full because I
Of
think it's
course.
important, salient. So this is the last paragraph here, Legionaries, and let me read. Violence is the transformative action of radical aesthetics, the substance of higher existence asserted by those few mad ones who burn, 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 like Icarus, like dying stars, like a drop of ice, onto the blood-streaked snow. The artist is a killer, the finest killer, whose acts of violence birth the sacred element of life that courses through our veins with a painful wonderfulness heavy upon our overworked hearts. The artist is the finest killer. The artist squeezes the gentle flower, its colors bleeding onto a canvas, mixed with the blood of the mad killer, painted manically, high off the desire to contribute to the beauty, capital B by the way, which stabs their chest with restless envy. The death of the flower, the destruction of its innocent being, creates something stronger and more powerful than death. It creates immortality. It reaches into eternity. What we consider metaphysics or the sacred is a feeling. It is a feeling of reaching, of more. It is a feeling of an all-consuming, all-engulfing fire spreading wildly across the cosmos. It is a holy war to etch our will into the fabric of the infinite. Our fire cuts across the Cartesian duality like it is the Gordian knot. No limitation is limitation. You are marvelous. The sublime can come into being by chance. The ocean waves, the mountain peaks, the endless forests of the north, or the eternal expanse of sparkling lights waiting for us to reach them. These are born from chaos. But the intentional will, the product of the artist, is born of Eros. It is not chance, but the cosmic gift born from chance. The chance for us to assert a free will and embrace our agency in such a way as to shed our blood across the stars and transform a malleable reality into something more. Colors are just colors, and the wood and bristles of a brush, even the technique of painting, just a how. But what will we create? Why will we create it? We are heroic existentialists, ready to commit acts of violence to assert our cosmic beautification, ready to create a hyper-reality of vitality. Our rebellion is not passive, our rebellion is real, not to become gods or God, but something more, something beyond. And this is a quote by Heraclitus. This world, which is the same for all, was not created by any god or man, but it was, and is, and will be, an ever-living fire. Heraclitus. Well, that was, when I read that, I was like getting chills. That was exactly the perfect personification, a perfect simulacrum of exactly what we've been talking about. Is the aesthetic expression of a people, of an individual, right, through time, to basically affirm death. And through affirming death, you overcome it, and you overcome it in the acts of beauty and art and the nation in which one lives. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, and another thing to consider in what I'm talking about, of course, is also the fact that in combating and in putting yourself in opposition to utility, it also echoes Heidegger's warning about technology, and also the warning of different ways of thought that lead to life denial. And I think that ultimately we can go back to the Buddhists, and what do they say? And look at the middle path of Buddhism. And the middle path of Buddhism is a path to death. It's a being to death. It ultimately is controlling everything. As the Buddhist, you seek the middle path, a middle ground of pain and pleasure. And what that ends up doing is actually reduce your experience in the world. If all life is suffering, craving, right, and then the cessation after fulfilling your craving and being in the samsara, if all that is bad, then detachment from that, controlling yourself to reject that, is controlling yourself to death. It's no different than what Heidegger talks about with technology leading to the domination of man. Once we can control everything, we can control every outcome, we also lose our life and we end up in death. It's like playing a video game with the cheat codes unlocked and you have unlimited money, unlimited whatever. That's death, because now what's the point? And in fact, conflict is the very essence of where meaning comes out of. And then beauty comes from the clashing of wills. It comes from strife. It comes from conflict. And if one will were to take primacy over all others, then it would be akin to death. It would be like heaven. Heaven is perfect, right? But who wants to live in perfection? Who wants to live in heaven? Who wants to live in a state of artificial bliss? Because that's essentially what it is. Because we as humans, with all our intricacies, if we were to go to heaven, all that would be gone. They say heaven is a place where there's no pain, even no craving, right? You're just in this perfect state of death. It's death. But the cessation of pain and suffering and pleasure and all these different things, conflict, is death. That's not something that I want to live in. That's something without agency. That's something without freedom. And it's important to consider when we talk about the sublime, when we talk about appropriation of excess and where it gets directed towards, is that even if we win somehow here, that you must always seek new conflict and new battles and new triumphs, new peaks to descend and ascend and overcome. There's so many different things that fall into this existential will to meaning, this will of becoming. And once you reach a point of control, too much utility, life denial, in, let's say, the ascetic Buddhist sense, you're also reaching the end of all life. You're reaching the end of the will. The will has no more meaning anymore. Because once everything's determined to be such a way that's perfect, there's no point to think. There's no point to assert your agency. There's no point to act. There's no point to create art. And ultimately, what my ideas are against is they're against utility. That's why I'm against equality. That's why I'm against asceticism. I'm against that which tries to dim the burning fire, which is life itself. And fires hurt. They're scorching. You put your hand on the fire and it hurts, but you also feel. You feel more. And of course, you might feel too much. It's like the drug addict. You do too much life in one instance. You burn yourself too much. Eventually, your body will reach a point of shock, right? And you'll pass out. There's a lot of ways that you can deny life. You can deny life by trying to have too much of one kind of life, right? The life of the gooner, the mind gooner, watching their eye porn, right? That's life denial too. There's so many different ways. And the whole project of the future is being aware of this war that is going on, the material war, which you have to win. You can't be a Luddite. You can't deny the material war. You have to be aware of utility, not utilitarianism, but utility, the purpose of things and the benefit of things. Be aware of utility, but do not try to seek utilitarianism. I think there's an important distinction there. Power has utility. Things of utility are instrumental to exerting and cultivating your power and your strength. These things are all important. Don't deny this, but also appropriate these things, right? Embrace mechanization and technologization. I don't even know that's a fucking word, but all this so that we can enact this vision of becoming, that we can enact this appropriation of excess towards the sublime, towards creating things that have no purpose, but that are attempts by us to express our existential angst in productive ways. In great monoliths, in great structures, in beautifying the cosmos, which is essentially my project. Because if we don't, ultimately we're going to remain in a state of spiritual neurosis, whether that's death, the cessation of all senses in one form or another, or if it's just, being in the samsara. You're either stuck in the samsara or you're outside of the samsara. What you should really be doing is expanding the samsara, using the samsara to your advantage, living within the samsara and finding beauty within it, winning it itself. Don't try to avoid the inevitable war of progress in the future. Be active in life and be active in this struggle, but to an ends, and not an ends that is a destination, but it ends that is a path forward. One interpretation of Hegel that I read from Dr. Jason Durjani was that the absolute ideal is more so an awareness of reality met rather than a destination of truth and the end of history as a destination, which is quite interesting. I'll have to do more study myself on that regard. But, no end
Right. It's
it
basically
is
an
the purpose.
ideal, a self-perpetuating ideal, an ideal that does not have a finality. The eschatology is one in which there is no end date. It's basically ad infinitum, and it's an infinite game,
Yeah.
which is different from a finite one, right? And I think that that is the death of a soul, is when you make yourself the like an end, right? A means to a very specific end, as opposed to a total human being with a kind of quest that's an ever-living quest, an ever-searching, ever-expanding, ever-fighting quest of conquest, right? And I think this is something we're going to develop on the next few months here, and definitely expound. But I wanted to reiterate, and I don't want to take any words out of Pat's mouth, of course, is the international nature of what we're trying to achieve here. For as much as I am an American patriot and I'm searching for the advantage of my nation, I also want to revivify and beautify all the other nations and cultures of the world with this heroic principle that we're trying to expound and help them out. Because I think if you look at Japan today, if you look, I mean, throughout the world, we are all beset by increasingly the same problem. The problem of utilitarianism, the problem of bug life ascendant. And how is it that we can achieve the heroic life together, legionaries, together, no matter where you come from, for your country? How is it that you can beautify, as an artist, as a warrior, the future? And just, I want to leave it there. If you have any parting remarks, Pat, just let me know.
Yeah, no, I guess my final things I'll say is that I'm continuing to attempt to develop a system, let's say, because I don't think systems are ends, but I think you do have to systematize. That's something that Nietzsche even was going to embark on. I say it in a lot of videos. Nietzsche's will to power was initially intended to be something akin to a system of his philosophy. I think it's important to offer systems, to offer
Yes.
actual structures of belief, not necessarily to be held forever, but because we have to build off of them. You do have to assert something. You
Like
can't
a scaffolding, or a
Sure.
foundation, something like that, right? Or a compass, maybe, something like that.
I see it more as just history itself. The one thing that you should take from eternal recurrence is not to take it literally, as history is not progressing towards specific ends, and perhaps regardless of what Nietzsche meant with eternal recurrence, I do think there's value in it, of course. Value in not seeing an ends as a destination, not seeing a cessation, right? Not seeing a final point. However, you should also not see eternal recurrence as meaning that history is cyclical. You should see a progress of history in the Hegelian sense, in the sense that the early Iranians did, in the sense that we are working towards something. Now, that something does not have to be predefined, nor does it have to be static, nor does it have to be overly specific and concretized, but life should be a history. And it's a history with lots of different, for example, I talked about the Roman Empire and different authors of Rome writing the Book of Rome, and of course the Book of Life and transcendent life, transcendence in the sense of going forward rather than transcendence as a return to something before and using that as authority, but transcendence in the sense of actual transcendence, actually going beyond what we are now, evolving and moving towards that next point of history, of post-human history, that is an ever-evolving ontology, an ever-evolving history. And that history has figures that we should recognize. We should recognize the Homers. We should recognize the Alexanders, the Caesars, as part of this history that's progressing humanity forward, right? And you, as somebody who might be able to come up with a system, right, which is not an ends, it's still something that people build off of. Maybe you call it a foundation, or you call it a ladder, or as I like to say, we're building Babel, a cosmic Babel, a tower. And of course, a tower is always elevating. And of course, in reality, ideas are more like peaks and valleys, because we have intellectual dark ages. I think we're in one right now. There's only 3 real philosophers of this time, I think, and that's Jason Georgiani, Nick Land, and Slavoj Žižek. That's it. There's no other philosopher right now. really, who's asserting new and original ideas that aren't just very niche syntheses of post-structuralism or liberal ethics like Rawlsian type stuff. There's not a lot going on right now. We are in an intellectual dark age. We don't have enough people creating new systems. But ultimately, it's a tower, right? Maybe the tower gets shot down a couple notches, but it's a tower, and each brick in the tower is important, even if it's not the final brick that will be laid. And I intend to lay a brick. I'm going to lay a brick. No, but I'm going to pave a brick into that tower, and it might be obsolete in a sense, but it's never truly obsolete. So, same with science. Sir Isaac Newton, the contributions he made to science were incomplete. There's no theory of everything. People tried to come up with a theory of everything. That was also insufficient. It's insufficient to see an ends where we don't have to work anymore. It's like you say, we build the sandcastle. The only difference, Lance, between your sandcastle analogy and reality is that the sandcastle might get bigger each time.
Right.
We're trying to build a bigger and bigger and bigger sandcastle.
To expound on that Newton idea, remember that Newton was a great physicist and mathematician because he was a devoted theologian. Specifically to the Christian Bible, and a lot of his calculations and insight into science, into physics, was actually derived from his pursuit of the end times and theology. But of course, you'd have Christians who say, well, that's because the Bible is the truth. But remember, the Bible came about and Christianity came about because of the Roman Empire, and because of X, Y, or Z, because of Plato, and then before him, and so on. And so this is just another, concrete let's say historical example of what you're saying, is that effectively all our actions are not in vain. They're part of this ever evolving structure, this great will that's being erected through time and space, what we call history. So yes, it's never in vain. And even if when we lay our stone into this edifice, right? I don't like the Tower of Babel. I like thinking about maybe a Roman triumphal arch, because I guess I'm a little bit of a Roma-boo. I don't know if you could tell. But either way, even if it's shoddy or if it's a mistake and it's malplaced, the next person, the next iterative cultural achievement will replace it and make it better, because it'll be able to visualize where mistakes were made, where there was something good in it, and therefore build and expound on that. So I completely agree with Warrior, and this is the element of our conquest, of our artistic thrust. If you're visualizing very phallic imagery, you should. I will put my penis between your left and right hemispheres. But without further ado, Warrior, any last comments?
Yeah, gay. No, I'm just kidding. No last comments. I'm going to write a lot more. I think I'm going to start writing frequently on Substack, because I realize with YouTube videos, sometimes you can't really get your ideas out there in a way that can be analyzed. And I really want to start asserting something that can be analyzed, that can be contrasted with other people's thoughts, that's original. And that's really the power of writing, I think. So I'm going to start writing a lot more essays. Hopefully we can continue to cover them, and maybe another book will come by at some point.
100%. I look forward to it. Well, either way, Sergeant Bartz just came back with the combat report, after action report here. It looks like Warrior, you and I are going to have to go on an op right now. So without further ado, Legionaries, this is the Warrior Philosopher speaking about radical aesthetics, Sergeant Barnes, General Lance, and this is the War Room, signing off.